Section 7 of Under the Guns, A Woman's Reminiscences of the Civil War, by Annie Wittenmyer. A painful accident. The smoke of the battlefield at Shiloh had cleared away. The dead had been buried; the wounded gathered up, and their ghastly wounds dressed, so that the people who came crowding to the battlefield saw little of the horror of war. Among the multitudes who came down with supplies and words of sympathy and encouragement was Governor Harvey of Wisconsin, a grand, loyal man. He walked over the battlefield, the scene of the recent terrible conflict, and through the hospitals improvised for the accommodation of the thousands who had been wounded, and over the score and more of steamboats where many of the wounded were quartered. He had given his promise of support to the men who stood between the North and the sword and torch of war. And now, with a hasty farewell to the crowd of distinguished patriots and officers who came down to wish him Godspeed on his return to the loyal state of Wisconsin, he stepped upon the single plank that bridged the little space between the shore and the boat. There were a few steps forward, a misstep, a sudden plunge, and the flowing tide engulfed him out of sight. There was a moment of awful suspense. He did not rise. Men plunged into the water, reaching out their hands in every direction to find the lost one, but alas! he was not found till life was extinct. The boat on which he was going to take passage was lying just above our sanitary boat, and a number of us saw him make the misstep and fall. That was a sad day to us all. A sad day for the Army of the Tennessee. A sad day for the state of Wisconsin. A sad day for the wife, a grand, noble woman, who, crushed by the heavy blow, waited in almost speechless agony for the bringing home of her dead. But in those heroic days women did not sit down in speechless grief to weep over their dead, but, crushing back their tears, consecrated themselves to the cause of humanity and their country. Mrs. Governor Harvey was no exception to this rule. Still staggering under this stunning blow, she consecrated herself to service in the Sanitary Commission and to the hospital work, and in blessed and unwearying service for others solaced her own deep grief. Who shall know how much comfort and encouragement the presence of this fair, beautiful, refined lady brought into the hospitals where so many homesick and pain-weary boys lay on their beds, longing for the sight of a woman's face, and tender touch of a woman's hand? Often, amid the sickening scenes of the overcrowded hospitals, I met her on her weary round of holy service. And at the close of the war she was active in the establishment of a home for the orphan children of soldiers in Wisconsin. Bursting of a shell behind my carriage. The line of battle was so closely drawn around Vicksburg that every camp and hospital and wagon train with provisions and ammunition was under fire. Every worker of the Christian and Sanitary Commissions, who ventured out to labor with the sick and the dying, knew that the Confederate sharpshooters at many points were within easy range, and that the flying shot and shell, that at times almost darkened the sky, were liable to drop in the pathway of the worker and blot him or her out of existence. None but the more courageous remained on the field. Curiosity hunters and bombastic dress parade workers fled from the scene as from a battlefield. For in truth every inch of ground about Vicksburg was a battlefield. The perplexities of the service, and the dangers attending every effort made to relieve the suffering, were so great, and the laborers in consequence so few, that every helper was overwhelmed and overworked. One day, coming in from a weary round, a day's work of unusual peril and hardship, we reached a point in the road sheltered from the enemy by a clump of trees. Though at no great distance from the Confederate guns, it seemed more secure because we were out of sight of the frowning batteries. Suddenly there was a crash in the timber, and we knew and heard no more. We were all so stunned that we did not know that a shell, crushing through the tops of the trees, had struck the ground in the middle of the roadway, not 40 feet behind our carriage. If it had come a moment sooner, we would all have been scattered in fragments to the four winds. As it was, the road was torn up so that it was impossible for teams to pass till it was repaired. The horses fell to the earth, the drivers seemed dazed for a time, the carriage was covered with the dirt thrown out, for an ox might have been buried in the pit that one shell dug out. though it was the main thoroughfare, along which much of the ammunition and provisions were hauled. Fortunately no teams were nearer than our own, and no one was killed or hurt. If these lines should fall under the eyes of George, the driver, a soldier detailed for that service, he will excuse me for saying that he was about the worst frightened person I ever saw. That evening he said: "I wish you would release me and ask for some one else. I'd rather be with my regiment behind the fortifications than driving around this way all the time." "You'll feel better about it in the morning, George. You will get over the shock. And then, too, remember that those who are behind the fortifications may be ordered at any time to make a charge, which would be more dangerous than the work you are now doing. But think about it, and if in the morning you would rather go back to your regiment, I will have the change made." The next morning George was all right, and he continued to drive for me until after Vicksburg was taken. Meeting a rebel woman at Nashville. There was great rejoicing over the fall of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. The gunboats and transport vessels were pressing on to Nashville, which was occupied by the Union Army soon after the fall of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. I went up on the first transport. The women were mostly left behind in the scramble to get out of the city, and they were more intense in war spirit and partisan feeling than the men. In the heat of the excitement, the chief hotel was thronged with both parties, where I took lodgings. The women sung ditties about Beauregard and Davis before the door of my bedroom till midnight at intervals. The great parlor of the hotel was a scene of the utmost confusion, judging from the tumult of angry voices. The women blamed the men about them. "Every man who is able to bear arms ought to be ashamed to be seen outside of a war camp in days like these," was the sharp rejoinder of a woman to her husband. I did not hear his answer, but suppose from her reply that he said he would only be throwing away his life. "Throwing away your life, indeed! A man that is not true to our cause at such a time ought not to live." Some one was sitting at the piano, and banged the keys of the instrument in wildest fury to drown the sound of the contentions. The next morning, in the dining room, every Southern man and woman gave us all a wide berth, not deigning to sit at the same end of the dining room. After breakfast I went for a few minutes into the parlor. The lady whose voice I had heard in falsetto the night before followed me, accompanied by her colored nurse girl, carrying her baby, perhaps 6 months old. I had no purpose of controversy in my heart, and so when the lady said, "My baby is named after the best man in the world, Beauregard," I only smiled. "I suppose you Yankees think you can conquer us?" "That is what the people of the North hope to do." "Well, you can't. There is not men enough in the North to conquer us; for when you kill the men off, the women will take up arms." "Well, madam, there are thousands of men gathering and drilling in the North, and they will soon be here; and it's their firm purpose to maintain the Union, cost what it will." "They'll kill the women, will they?" "They will conquer the South." "Contemptible hirelings! They'll kill the women, will they?" she hissed. "I don't think they want to kill the women. But if that is necessary for the maintenance of the Union, I suppose they will have to do it." "Wretches! Wretches! They'll kill the women, will they?" she screamed, and her eyes blazed fire and scintillated like the eyes of a maniac. I thought she was going to leap upon me in her fury. We were standing facing each other, and I made up my mind that if she did assault me I would do my little share of fighting, and choke a little of the treason out of her. But she changed her mind, and rushed from the room, slamming the door after her with such force as to shake the house to its foundations. A year after that she was playing the rôle of a Union woman, and was quite popular as a loyal Southerner among the officers. No one in these calm days can imagine the fiery, cruel spirit of war. I was not afraid. The Stars and Stripes were over us, and the Union Army within call. But what seems laughable to me now was exceedingly exasperating and insulting at the time. There is no question about the matter. The Southern women, in their blind, partisan fury, prolonged the contest to the last extreme of desperation. They could not believe defeat possible. Poem. No longer we hear the clash of arms, and the cannon's fearful booming. No longer the torch of war alarms, our cities and homes consuming. The smoke of battle has cleared away, and Peace her vigil is keeping, though wet with tears are the flowers we lay where our gallant dead are sleeping. End poem. Visiting hospitals under the guns. I came down the river with a heavy lot of supplies at the beginning of the siege. I sent an order to the quartermaster for an ambulance. Instead of sending the ambulance he sent me a fine silver-mounted easy carriage captured at Jackson, which I afterwards found drew the fire of the enemy. It was reported in Vicksburg that an old experienced general, too crippled to ride on horseback, made his rounds in that carriage, and the Confederates made it a target every day. One captain of sharpshooters told Dr. Maxwell of Davenport, Iowa, that his men had sent more than 100 shots after that carriage, supposing some high official was the occupant. He was very much shocked to know that they had been shooting at a lady. In most cases the shot fell low, but the wheels were chipped till they were quite a curiosity. I drove out in company with Mrs. General Stone to the nearest hospital one day. We had gone through the tents, and attended to the business that had brought us, and were standing beside the carriage when a shell from Vicksburg burst near us, scattering fragments all around us. To me the shock was terrific. I could feel my flesh crawl in the most uncomfortable way, and every hair on my head seemed to stand upright. "Are you so near the enemy's guns?" I questioned. "Oh, yes. All the hospitals are under fire. A shell burst in this hospital a few days ago, killing one man and wounding 3 others." "It's horrible that sick men must be placed under fire. Why don't the authorities remove the sick and wounded to a safe distance?" I spoke with some spirit. "You forget," said the surgeon, "that General Johnson's army is near, and that we are forced to draw in our lines. We would rather take the risk of a random shell than to risk being between 2 contending armies during a battle." That was quite another view of the matter, and now I was brought face to face with the facts of the situation. If I visited the hospitals I must do it under fire. I had been under fire before, but only for an hour. To go out day after day under a rain of lead was quite a different thing. I went back to the sanitary boat at the Yazoo landing in a very thoughtful mood. The muddy, sluggish stream was well named Yazoo, meaning the River of Death. That night was spent in prayer. The next morning I arose with a courage born of faith. I seemed immortal. Not a bullet had been molded that could hit me. I went out to my work without a fear. My carriage was struck time and again, and bullets whizzed past me, but never a feeling of fear crept into my heart. I was "under the shadow of his wings, and he covered me with his feathers." Mrs. General Stone, whose husband commanded the right wing of the army, and who now lives at Mount Pleasant, Iowa, camped with her father out on the bluffs. She invited me to leave the sluggish river with its miasma, and come up and stay with her, and I accepted the invitation. She had a beautiful tent put up beside her own, and as the lizards were very abundant, the feet of our cots were put in jars of water, and we tucked up the covers about us so as to keep them off our beds. We could hear their little feet scratching as they raced after each other over the tents. The soldiers got used to them, but somehow we women shrank from contact with anything so nearly akin to the serpent family. Night and day the battle went on. The shells with their burning fuses would sail up into mid-air like stars of the first magnitude, and burst into a shower of sparks and fragments, setting the heavens ablaze with their scintillation, and jarring the foundations of the earth with the thunder of their explosions. We became so accustomed to the horrid sounds of war, that the absence or abatement of it would awaken us out of our sleep. Exhibitions of mother love. To what lengths affections would carry women in the war. War brought heavy burdens of anxiety and sorrow to the woman on both sides of the lines during the terrible struggle of 1861 to 1865. The anxious waiting for news from the battlefield, the heart-breaking scrutiny of the list of wounded and killed, cannot, with their sorrows, be measured by words and phrases. One Philadelphia mother whose husband and son were in the war received news that her son had been killed in one of the smaller battles of Virginia. She determined to recover the body and bring it home for burial. After many delays and hindrances, she reached the regiment of which he was a member. She had walked 3 miles to get there, and had left the casket she had brought down at the station, where fire had destroyed everything but the track. The soldiers brought up the coffin, and the next morning exhumed the body. They had wrapped him carefully in his blanket, and marked the spot with a rough board, on which they had carved his name and regiment and company with their knives. When they lifted him out, and laid him at her feet, she recognized him at once. "Yes, this is my boy," she said, pushing the damp hair back from his fair young face. The soldiers, who were glad to render the heart-broken mother any service they could, carried the coffin down to the railroad track where the station had once stood, and instructed her how to "flag a train," and assuring her that "a train might come at any time," they left her there with her dead. There was no human dwelling in sight. She seated herself on her son's coffin, beside the charred timbers and ashes, to await the coming of the train. Behind her was the little valley where the Union troops were stationed to guard an important pass. On either side of her were mountains that rose majestically, that might be infested with wild beasts and creeping things. Before her was a little brook, and the bands of iron along its banks that rendered it possible to make the journey through that mountain gorge by rail. The afternoon wore away, but no train came. The shades of night closed her in, but no sound of wheels greeted her ears. She built a little fire so as to signal the train. The sharp notes of the night birds, the fighting of the wildcats on the side of the mountain, the mysterious noises in the air, the sound of stealthy footsteps near her, all fell with fearful distinctness on her ears; for every nerve was strained to its utmost tension. But no train came to relieve her weary vigil. Her garments were wet with the dews of night, and she added wood to the smoldering fire, for the cheerful blaze comforted her. As the night wore on, all nature seemed at rest. The night birds ceased their calls, the wildcats climbed higher up the mountain, and the whippoorwill ceased its mournful song. But this was even more terrible, as every remaining sound was more distinct. The rustling of a leaf, or a noise in the bushes, sent the blood hurrying to her heart. At last gray streaks of light began to climb over the mountain in the east, and were tinged with purple and orange, and soon the white light of day fell about her. But it was not till late in the afternoon of the second day that a train came, and her weary vigil ended. For 26 hours she had been alone with her dead. She reached Washington without delay, and before boarding the train for Philadelphia, saw the coffin of her son put on board. But when she reached Philadelphia, she found that by some mistake the remains had been left at Baltimore. She telegraphed back, and waited in the station till they were brought to her, and then followed them to her own house. Afterward her husband was killed, and she went to the front again and secured his body, and brought it home for interment. Who shall measure the anguish of the women who watched at home till there was one dead in almost every house? A mother in Maine received the news that her only son had been wounded and taken prisoner, and had been sent to Richmond. "I am going to him," she said. Her husband and neighbors tried to dissuade her. On her journey toward the front she called on Governor Andrew, of Massachusetts. "My dear madam," he said, "I can do nothing for you. The only thing I could do would be to give you a letter of introduction to President Lincoln." "Well, give me that." When she reached Washington she called on the President, and after a weary waiting was shown into his presence. "Why, madam," said the great-hearted Lincoln, "I can do nothing for you. If you were within our own lines I would give you a pass, but I cannot send you to Richmond. At the best I could only get you beyond our own pickets." "Then please give me a pass beyond your pickets." This was done, and she passed the Union lines to fall into the hands of the Confederate pickets. The latter refused to allow her to proceed. "I am going right on to Richmond. Shoot if you will." And she started on. They did not shoot, but took her into camp, and from the headquarters of that command she was sent on to Richmond. When she reached the hospital where her son lay, the surgeon refused to allow her to see him. "I must see him. I'm sure it will do him good to see his mother." As soon as the son saw her, he cried out, "There is my mother! I knew she would come. I'll get well now." And sure enough, he did. The Surrender of Vicksburg. For days there had been unusual activity in the camp. The 4th of July was to be celebrated by a general bombardment; and if there were signs of yielding, a sharp assault and an attempt to capture the city would be made. The besieged party was not in ignorance of what was going on. The pickets and sharpshooters, and the soldiers at points where the fortifications touched each other, had given the whole programme of a grand 4th of July celebration in boastful proclamations. Everything was at fever heat on the 3rd of July, though the firing was kept up at the usual rate till about 1 or 2 p.m. Suddenly all firing ceased. The silence could almost be felt. There had been pauses before, lasting an hour or more, during interviews under a flag of truce. But as the afternoon slowly wore away, and the firing was not resumed, the excitement became intense. Later it was reported that General Grant and General Pemberton had met under a great spreading oak tree just inside the Union lines, and that General Grant had made his terms known in the memorable phrase, "Unconditional surrender." It was a sad hour for Pemberton. His army was starving; his ammunition and his fighting force were so diminished that to continue the siege seemed madness. And yet he had held out so long, hoping help might come, it might now be near him, that it was hard to surrender. His was a fearful struggle. Not many words passed between these two men as they stood there, a little apart from their staff officers. Later, the time of the surrender was fixed at 9 a.m. on the 4th of July, which was the next morning. The news flew through the camp at lightning speed. Soon everybody, sick and well, knew that Vicksburg had surrendered. The firing had ceased, but on both sides every man stood at his post. There was little sleep for any of us that night. The stillness was so unusual and impressive, and the excitement so intense, that sleep fled. The morning of the 4th dawned fair and beautiful. Very early in the morning, in company with Dr. Maxwell and Mrs. General Stone, I drove out to General Logan's headquarters, whence the army was to begin the triumphant march into the city. We took our position on the battlements of Fort Hill, where we had a full view of the city and surrounding country. The point where we stood had been more sharply contested than any other. The fort had been undermined and blown up; and amid the confusion and disaster that buried 100 or more in its ruins, an attempt had been made to scale the fort and enter the city. Before the dust of the explosion had cleared away, a hand-to-hand battle was raging, and hand grenades were being tossed as freely as balls on a playground, which exploded with great destruction. The roar of battle had raged again and again about that fort, but now all was calm and still at the dawning of this day of peace. As far as we could see, the muskets were stacked, and white handkerchiefs were fluttering above them. The Confederate and Union soldiers stood along the lines in groups, talking as friendly as though they had never exchanged a shot with intent to kill. But there was no loud talking. All seemed to feel that it was a moment of deep solemnity. At last the stillness was broken by the tramp of horsemen, and General Grant, with his staff of officers following, passed near us and honored us with a military salute; not with guns, but that peculiar and graceful lifting the right hand, open to the full length of the arm, with a graceful wave and touching the cap; a salute we never see in civil life, unless some old soldier forgets himself. Following close upon these came General McPherson and his staff. General McPherson was the most kingly looking man on horseback I ever saw. In personal appearance he was a prince among men at any time, but on this glad morning he seemed to be grander and taller under the enthusiasm and flush of victory than ever before. General Logan followed with his staff and his division on foot. We stood there with our field glasses in our hands, watching them as they marched down into the city. There was a long halt. They approached each other, forming into long double columns, then we saw, opposite the blue, the gray forming into lines. Every eye was strained to take in the scene. There was a movement forward of officers, the flash in the bright sunlight of swords as they were handed over to the conquerors, and then handed back; for General Pemberton and his staff were allowed to carry their swords, and enjoy the freedom of the city. They had conducted an honorable warfare, and must not be humiliated. But now there was another point of interest. The Confederate flag had floated over the court house tower through all these months of conflict, but the Stars and Stripes was now to take its place. Soon a little glinting of our loved flag came into view. But what could be the matter? Surely a tangle in the ropes could be adjusted in a few minutes. All stood in breathless anxiety. Such a delay at such a time was startling, and every moment seemed an hour to those who were watching from a distance. At last, with rapid sweep, the Stars and Stripes was run to the top of the staff, and a heaven-sent breeze unfurled it to our delighted eyes. What a burst of enthusiasm greeted it! We waved our handkerchiefs, while men who had faced the cannon's mouth for the flag sobbed in their wild joy, and flung their caps into the air. But the Confederate soldiers, as far as we could see, stood with folded arms, silent and motionless. And yet, with all our gladness that the guns had ceased to belch forth their murderous fire, there was a deep fathomless undertone of sorrow over the cruel, bloody work of red-handed war, that the glad acclaim of triumph and victory could not drown. End of Section 7.